Hey everyone, welcome to another session of Podchaser Pro's webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about some pretty seismic changes that we are seeing within the podcast guest booking landscape, especially from January of 2025 up until now. It is almost the end of June, so we found it useful, timely to unpack what's been trending and what's been changing when it comes to podcast guest booking. And we will get all of that pertinent info in a second. But first, the workshop structure for today. We're going to start with 4 reasons why guest booking's gotten harder. Surprise, surprise, that is kind of the theme here. But next, we're going to unpack some of the solutions to these problems. Then we're going to talk about the shift to video as more and more podcasts are adopting simulcast or audio plus video. This has major implications for our abilities to get clients booked as guests on podcasts. But of course, there are going to be some things that we can do about it. And then we'll also allow some time for Q&A at the end. But first, who am I? I'm Trent Anderson. I'm the head of growth and strategy here at Podchaser. I do work with brands, PR agencies, and podcast networks. But I think one of the things that does make me a little more qualified to talk about this topic in particular is I used to run the guest booking service called Podchaser Connect that sat on top of the Podchaser Pro platform. Obviously, that agency has since been acquired by a larger agency. But we were booking about 80 clients per month as guests on podcasts back in 2022, 2023, and early 2024. So I also run a lot of experiments for our team. So getting our key opinion leaders booked as guests on podcasts, as well as our parent company too. So I'm in the trenches with you. I've sat in your same shoes, and I'm going to tell you kind of from my own firsthand experience what I'm seeing as well. A lot of this is going to be backed by data, and we're also going to, of course, show some of the underlying reasons for why things are the way they are. So first, we're going to get into the 4 reasons. These are going to be the 4 primary reasons why guest placements seemingly have gotten harder, especially over the last 6 months. And the first reason is going to be format changes. Now, I posted a video in promotion of this webinar that kind of underscored all of this. And if you're not a numbers person, you didn't do well in math in middle school or high school, I tried to pull out some of the key stats to make it a little bit more palatable. But the methodology here um, ultimately tells us that there's a decline in the number of interview-based shows. So what I did is I took a look at active English-speaking podcasts with over 1,000 monthly listens. Now, the 1,000 monthly listens is somewhat arbitrary. I did pick that though because that's usually going to be the lower threshold in terms of acceptability and working with some of our clients and what we see come through in onboarding forms from our pro users. But all to say, there are about 60,000 active English podcasts with over 1,000 monthly listens. The next thing I wanted to do was understand how many of those frequently featured guests. So I threw on our has guest filter. So if you are a Podchaser Pro user, you know how useful that filter can be. And that number was about 38,000. So what we next did was divide the total or divide those that have guests divided by the total number, and that got us about 63%, 63.4% of current podcasts frequently feature guests, and that's going to be inclusive of all time. But I also wanted to compare it to some more recency. So what I did next is took a look at active English podcasts that had their first episode published within the last 3 months, and also had that 1,000 monthly reach threshold. And so there's about 1,400 of those. And then I also overlaid the has guest filter to have parity between the two equations, ultimately 46.4%. So what is the TLDR of this? New shows have adopted different formats that aren't necessarily purely interview based. So all podcasts about 63.4%, but new podcasts only about 46.4%. So that is a market difference. Now, there's a couple caveats to this, of course, and I did reference this in the promotional post, but this is really going to vary by category. So when I put on a business category for podcasts that met these criteria, the business podcasts are still frequently featuring guests about 60% of the time, which kind of falls in line with our historical average or percentage. So that's good. Now, other categories are going to be different. For example, I saw tech was a lot lower. So this isn't all doom and gloom, right? There's still going to be some dependencies, again, based on your client, the niche that they serve, the industry that they're in, et cetera. The second reason why podcast guest booking has seemingly become harder, especially over the last 6 months, is everyone's probably love-hate relationship with AI. Now, again, I use AI. You hopefully use AI for some of these things. It has a great kind of premise in that it can increase our productivity, et cetera. But is productivity being conflated with actual outcomes? And based on what we're seeing and having some conversations with podcasters themselves, there is a growing concern about the use of AI to pitch podcasts, generally speaking. Now, if you've attended previous webinars, you know that I hosted one about how to use AI prompts to do a lot of like the early research work for you. So if you want to go back and reference that webinar, it'll be up on our YouTube channel. Um, I even kind of outlined a way in which you can help build a podcast guesting program strategy for clients, which I think is one of my favorite use cases for AI when it comes to this. But when it comes to actually podcast guest booking, is AI helping or hurting? There's going to be a couple things I think we should address here. One, again, the pros of yeah, AI usage and guest booking is going to be that research component. But the second is, man, you can really scale outreach fast. And some platforms, competitive platforms, boast about being able to send 750 pitches a week. Well, that's about 3,000 per month. And I can't think of any key opinion leader or person that you want to get booked as a guest on podcast where they'd have a total addressable market of 3,000 podcasts. I guess maybe if you're Oprah or Michael Jordan or Barack Obama, like maybe, I guess. But when it comes to your clients, there's just simply no way you should be even coming close to 3,000 pitches on a monthly basis. Now, even if some of those are follow-ups, say like you cut that in half, that's still 1,500 pitches. Again, I think that's way overdone. It's an interesting flex. I'll leave it at that. But one of the things I think that we need to take into consideration with all of this is the more that we fire off these spray and pray types of emails where we're mass blasting everybody and or having AI write our pitches and just letting the platform do its work, et cetera. There's quite a few problems with that. One, of course, is going to be, podcasters already are inundated with inbound pitches to varying degrees of quality, which we'll get into in a second. But second, there's like a real technical cost to this as well. And if you're looking at some of these words on the screen, like SPF, DMARC, DKIM, et cetera, and they look like a foreign language, that's okay. But these are some of like the technical underpinnings of how email service providers work. So whether you're using Outlook or Google for Business or an outreach tool, for example, a third-party tool, if you don't have SPF, DMARC, and DKIM properly set up within your ESP, I highly recommend going to your IT team or your system admin or whoever is in control of your email and just asking them, like, hey, can you run a quick check on our SPF, DMARC, and DKIM records? Because if you are sending a huge volume of email, oftentimes your efficacy of landing those emails in a podcaster's inbox are going to wane drastically if those records aren't properly set up. So that's one component of this from the technical perspective. The second technical kind of component we want to take a look at is recipients' email servers are also changing quite a bit. So there's a greater recognition of AI produced content within those. There are smarter filtering systems that automatically triage incoming emails into different categories. So if you're familiar with Gmail, right, you've got primary, you've got social, you've got promotions, etc. So taking all of that into consideration as well, if you're sending a ton of email, we want to focus on actually getting into the inbox first, right? And with just the pile of and mountain of volume of emails that are going out in today's day and age, we just want to be really mindful of this, right? So AI, super powerful. AI can help us uncover insights or ideas or strategies that we never would have deemed possible before, especially when we're crunched for time. But I think that's the appropriate application of AI when it comes to podcast guest booking. I would not simply have AI write my guest pitches and run all of this outbound by itself, because unfettered access is probably going to derail a lot of our campaigns. And one of the tricky things about this is it can also end up hurting your domain reputation from your email sending. So even if you're sending emails to clients and you've been marked as spam by a bunch of podcasters because you're not personalizing emails, you're sending a ton of them, hundreds, thousands, 3,000 a month, for example, you might not even get into your existing clients' inboxes either. So is that worth the risk for the quote unquote promise of scalability? I would just advise you to take a second look or a deeper look at that in and of itself. And one kind of last thing to take a look at, I was reading an article written by a podcaster recently, and he's got a 62 power score show. It's in the self employment and entrepreneurial space. It's got a pretty good following, 10,000 monthly listens. He's been doing it for a long time, over 670 episodes. And he recently published an article that said that he rejects 95% of podcast guest pitches. And that's kind of wild when you think about it. So automatically he's filtering out an incredible majority of guest pitches. And those that come through, there's still quite a bit of discernment that he has to exercise over those as well. So again, like this podcast guest booking has never been a volume game. It's always been aim small, miss small. We'll get into some of the solutions for that here in a bit. But again, AI is great when used appropriately or properly, and we don't want to just become spam cannons. The third reason why podcast guest booking has become harder in 2025 is increased competition. There's more interest in the podcasts ecosystem, generally speaking. There are more entrants into it. That, of course, has created more noise. Podcasts have gone mainstream, and podcasts have kind of experienced this ebb and flow of popularity. We are certainly riding one of the current peaks right now, which is great. It's great for everybody in the industry. Obviously, great for podcasters, folks such as yourselves. But if we think about 2020 pandemic era, right? Everyone was stuck at home. We became kind of bored at home, and we started to look to podcasts. And perhaps you remember those days, which seemed like yesterday, but somehow we're 5 years ago at this point. Then there was some decline in 2022, 2023, and then as 2024 started to crest, we saw podcasts become increasingly popular and more mainstream. A lot of reasons for that. A lot of folks within our industry, as well as outside of our industry, cite the podcast election. So the 2024 presidential election. I'm not going to get into the politics about that today. You could probably find articles on your own if you look them up. But all of a sudden, podcasts became in vogue again. They are largely more influential than some legacy media outlets, et cetera. So again, we're enjoying the kind of renewed interest and confidence in the podcast space. That also means that there's a lot more competition, right? And this is going to be some data that was published recently by Edison. Edison annually has what they call their infinite dial report. So if you just Google Edison 2025 infinite dial, you'll be able to access some of this data yourself. But again, just to kind of underscore how much more popular podcasts have become over the last couple of years. 2025 data shows us that 73% of Americans age 12 or older have consumed a podcast, and that's up 6% from 2024 and up 9% from 2023. And 55% of Americans listen monthly, which is an 8% jump from 2024 and a 13% jump from 2023. So again, as we can see, podcasts are growing considerably. It's meant a lot of great things for our industry and ancillary industries such as PR, comms, advertising, et cetera. But with that comes renewed interest in the medium, renewed interest from external partners, that sort of thing. So I just want to kind of underline all of this is good news. It does have some downside, but we're going to show you how to navigate through that. And of course, we've seen this firsthand on the Podchaser side. We've had record-breaking growth in our first 2 quarters here in 2025, which is incredible. But we feel it's our responsibility, our duty to have some more of these sobering conversations about the state of the industry, because we don't want this to be an unsustainable growth arc. We want podcasters, we want PR firms, we want comms agencies, we want advertisers to understand that podcasting will be as sustainable as we make it. And unfortunately, with some of the other things that we've talked about, whether it's AI or related, the more that we kind of dump into this unintentionally, like the worse the kind of longevity curve becomes. So we'll take a deep breath, take a step back, show how to be intentional about podcast outreach despite some of these challenges. And again, we're going to get to that throughout the rest of the session. So reason number 4, podcasters have become more discerning, and we really view this as an evolution of podcasting standards. The whole creator economy has been around for probably 5-6 years now at this point, but it's evolved from hobbyists to true professions. And that also means that standards have kind of elevated from hobbyist to professional level standards when it comes to podcasts. And because of this, more podcasters are leaving their 9 to 5s and becoming full-time creators. And when that happens, what we start to see are a couple different things. One, production qualities definitely go up. Two, support systems around the podcasters or the creators themselves increase considerably as well. Whether that's from joining a podcast network, which has a full kind of suite of services that they help from monetization perspective, marketing, sales, all that kind of stuff. So again, it's a great thing. Creator economy is booming, as we've noted in a couple slides. But as a result of that, if we're not also leveling up the standards with which we hold ourselves, we're not going to meet the podcasters where they're at in terms of that level of professionalism that they're going to expect. And as part of kind of that back office support or assistance, if you will, what we're seeing is a rise of third-party representation agencies for podcasts. Now, there are a few that represent a number of like large podcasts. One of them is going to be Central Talent Booking. They've represented podcasts since Mark Maron. That was their first foray into the podcast representation space. So what they do is effectively act as intermediaries for the podcaster, where they're going to field inbound podcast guest pitches. They're going to kind of understand what the podcaster is looking for. They're probably going to have a closer alignment to the podcaster's editorial calendar, which, again, we wish there were more public views of these types of editorial calendars. However, a lot of these are gated behind a gatekeeper, which is oftentimes going to be this third-party agency. But what these agencies also do is they proactively seek guests for these podcasts or these shows as well. So again, we're working on partnerships with a lot of these so we can get proper contact information associated with proper shows that they represent to make your lives easier as Podchaser Pro users. But again, this is something that often goes unnoticed or unknown within our space, and we want to shine a light on it because it does appear that this number is going to continue to grow. From a third perspective on this point, the pay to play with certain networks has increased as well. And almost every webinar that we do about podcast guest booking includes questions from attendees about how many podcasts are seeking some sort of payment for a guest appearance. And back when we were doing the guest booking as a service and the Connect days, I could tell you like 3-4 years ago, somewhere like 2.5%. Then every year it raised about 2.5% to 5%, dependent. By the time we exited the guest booking kind of service game, it was closer to 10%. I expect that number is roughly the same because podcasters, again, as we talked about from their monetization perspective, they're leveling up their game. They're leaving a 9 to 5. They need to make money. How are they going to make money? Of course, through sponsorships, through advertisements, et cetera. But also they're going to try to monetize every piece of their podcast. And one of the ways in which they can do that, of course, is by requiring a fee for founders, interviewees, et cetera, to appear as a guest on a podcast, right? So there are certain networks, some of them are clients, some of them are not, but there are certain networks that do charge a considerable amount of money to have guest appearances, which as earned media professionals, that's oftentimes going to be a no-go. However, sometimes it could be worth it depending on your client's goals, the audiences they want to reach, the alignment between the product or the service that your guest is selling or representing. But like for one example, Dear Media is a big podcast network. They produce great content. They're very early into that intersection between social media content and podcast content. They're fantastic at what they do. However, if you pitch a Dear Media show, with a client that wants to appear as a guest on one of the podcasts, I would expect to receive an email saying thanks for your interest. Here's our rates for founder interviews, for example, right? So again, no shade. They have to make money. They're a business. Totally get that. But we just want to make you guys aware that this is obviously a component to the podcast guest booking ecosystem. Next, in terms of the greater amount of discernment that podcasts are exercising, mandatory amplification of episodes has also become a greater expectation as well. So when you think about a podcaster, right, they've done a lot of hard work in creating content, distributing their content, building an audience, building a following, having fans, maybe they're doing merch, all of that. Like there's so much work that goes into creating a podcast, especially one that's got significant audience. If you or I to start a podcast today, I mean, we'd be hard pressed to get more than our moms or dads or brothers or sisters or aunts and uncles to listen to it, let alone 1,000 people, 10,000 people, etc. So as a result of that, this isn't necessarily a quid pro quo kind of equation, but one thing to point out is so many more podcasters are expecting their guests to shoulder some of the burden when it comes to promotion. There's nothing worse as a guest booker when you go through all of this time and all this energy to secure opportunities, do the research, etc. And then the episode goes live. It looks great. Everyone's happy. And then a couple of days later, you get an email back from the podcaster. Hey, what's the plan? Joe Smo didn't do anything with the episode, didn't promote it or anything. And that's a huge missed opportunity for a couple of reasons. One, it basically flies in the face of all that hard work that we just talked about that the podcasters put into their show and their content. Two, it's probably going to limit a lot of your future opportunities with that podcaster. And depending on who your client is and the clients you represent across your portfolio of customers, if you make a podcaster mad and they see your email come in after they've already had one of your guests that didn't do anything to promote the episode, and now you're going to pitch another guest, like they already have a bad taste in their mouth. And again, because podcasters are such a tight-knit community, and again, they've put in so much work into their programs, you're probably not going to have a lot of success. And this is especially troubling when you work with like a podcast network, and sometimes they're going to have a central individual who's going to handle guest booking across multiple podcasts, not just one individual show. Again, you're going to have kind of like this poisoning of the well effect. So oftentimes what we're going to recommend to our clients as they're pitching their clients as guests on podcasts is come to the table with some sort of promotion plan. So whether that's, you're going to promote it across your social channels, your newsletter, whatever it might be, hopefully that there is some semblance of a plan, because that's going to give the podcaster a lot more confidence in having your client as a guest on the show. And then finally, when it comes to being more discerning, podcasters have also adopted much more of this video and simulcast capability, which is an incredible opportunity for earned media professionals, because of course you're going to get the kind of baked in audio audience and the reach that's going to enjoy. But with simulcast, being able to be on YouTube, for example, second largest search engine in the world, like that's a huge boon to amplifying, your client's guest appearance. And one thing, to note when it comes to the rise of video, and we're going to get in a lot more detail about this towards the end of the session, but it's so unique, and the stakes are a lot higher, I would say. So whether that's from production value or the way that they appear on a podcast, like it's going to feel a little bit more similar to getting a client prepped for, a CNBC spot, although a CNBC, midday spot is probably going to be no more than 2 or 3 minutes of a segment in the middle of a program versus a podcast, which should be 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, depending on the show as well. So the level of preparedness that our guests need to have for video podcasts is certainly different than just an audio only. You lose a lot of the ability to edit, to redo certain aspects of a conversation as well. So this is, I'd call it a beige flag for our earned media clients because there's great opportunity with it, but it's going to require us to level up our professionalism when it comes to client preparedness for interviews as well. And again, this is going to be a chart. If you've attended one of our previous webinars before, you've probably seen this, but this is really just to kind of underscore the rise of video podcasts. Now, this data is about 6 months old, maybe a little bit longer than that. So I'd imagine these numbers have actually increased quite a bit. But again, huge opportunity. We just want to hammer home the point that preparedness for video podcast is prime. So again, we've had a little bit of a sobering conversation as it pertains to why it's getting harder to book clients as guests on podcasts. We know that formats are changing. We know that AI has made scalability a lot more feasible, with a very strong detriment. But what are we going to do? How do we win in what we're going to dub the harder than ever era? And I think if there's one theme to pull out of this, it's fast is slow and slow is fast. And it's an old adage, probably one that I heard from a football coach once upon a time. And we'll get into what that actually means, but just in a quick broad strokes, right? The more that we put into the process, the more we're going to get out of the process, and putting more into the process often means time, diligence, intentionality, etc. So if clients are looking for, hey, we've got to have 6 quick wins in the next month, we want to temper expectations. We want to reset expectations and kind of build a more comprehensive program. And that's what we will talk about next. So the first solution for kind of rising to the occasion of this harder than ever era is going to be research and diligence, which we might want to call phase 0, if you will. So again, the more you put in, the more you're going to get out. Now, with Podchaser Pro users, what we do is we give them a new client onboarding form. So anytime a new client signs up for Podchaser Pro, we send them an onboarding form. And in that onboarding form, we ask them questions about the guests they're representing, because Podchaser Pro users have the ability to tap into our team to actually build lists of best fit shows on their behalf. So we're going to ask questions about guest bio, other podcasts they might have appeared on, target audience, reach thresholds they're trying to hit, who they don't want to be in front of, these types of things. And with that, and why I'm bringing this up is, again, one of the questions that we ask in that onboarding form is for a guest bio. And I'd say about 50 to 60% of onboarding forms that we receive from our clients, the guest bio is simply copied and pasted from a corporate bio or a CV, or they've downloaded the person's LinkedIn page as a PDF and they upload it, right? And while that's fine, it is fairly sterile, and it doesn't always allow us to get creative or understand like really what makes this person tick. Because again, when we're talking about podcast interviews, these are going to be highly personal. There's a reason why podcasters interview people and not corporate logos, right? Now, of course, with the stories that our guests are going to tell, we want to weave in the company narrative, the things we want to kind of impart, position the brand in a positive light, et cetera. But we've got to go beyond just the corporate CV. So there's going to be a couple of different things that we can do to liven up the guest bios, if you will. One of my favorite things to do is going to be the first, last, best, worst exercise. I've done a whole webinar on that previously, so do go to the YouTube channel to take a look at that. But this is a very simple exercise, and I take no credit for creating it. This is actually created by Matthew Dix, who's a world-class storyteller. But how it's going to work is you're going to have 4 columns across the top: first, last, best, worst, and then you're going to have a series of prompts. So with these prompts, it could be dependent on who your client is, what they're trying to convey, et cetera. But let's say I was representing or working with a VP of sales at a B2B SaaS company. how I would extract some of this insight from the VP of sales, I would ask him, what was the first cold call you ever made? And what's interesting about that is if you have this conversation, all of a sudden you see like the liveliness of the respondent increase quite a bit because especially with something as kind of guttural as sales can be, a VP of sales probably knows exactly where they were, exactly who they cold called, exactly what they were wearing the first time they ever made a cold call because it was there was tension in that. And within that tension is where we find story. And where we find story is where we find resonance. And what are we trying to achieve with a podcast guest interview? Resonance between the podcast host, between the podcast guests, and of course, the podcast audience. So again, you can go through each of these steps, and you don't have to use all of them, right? You can pick and choose. So like, what was the best closed one in your career? And the VP of sales could say, "Oh, my wife was 8 months pregnant. We were staring down our mortgage payment. We were trying to get this deal, this enterprise deal over the line. It was 18 months into the process. Had gone through 3 different VPs of procurement on the prospect side at that point. And at the 11th hour, on January 31st, 2016, we were able to get the deal over the line, or December 31st, 2016, we were able to get the deal over the line, which meant I could go on paternity leave and, witness the birth of my child, et cetera. Like, again, we're going to be able to build a narrative or build a story around it. Again, that's going to be a very personal one, but we can obviously parlay that into the products or services that our guests are trying to sell or position, et cetera. But I guess one important call out of this is we really want to understand like the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, the how, all of these situations encapsulate. And we want to find those elements of tension. And tension could be, expectation violations. So I expected this to happen and something else totally happened. All of these are going to add suspense, a little bit of drama, a little bit of tension, and sometimes those make for really interesting sound bites when it comes to podcast guest interviews and certainly pitches as well, especially when kind of juxtaposed against what we see with these corporate CVs or bios. Another kind of exercise you could put your clients through is what we call like a POV or knowledge extraction session, which is going to be done through like intentional internal interviews. So again, you might want to use the first, last, best, worst exercise to do that. Or if you have the ability to sit down, with a client for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and really pull out from them their unique experience, their point of view, their perspective, why they think things are the way they are, how they think the world is changing, these types of things. Now, I know some of you might be representing clients that are Fortune 500 CEOs and they simply don't have the time in their schedule to make a 20 to 30-minute interview. In which case, I might actually say, let's revisit the roster of individuals at the organization, because sometimes we can get much better interviews from subject matter experts that are really in the weeds doing the thing. So for example, if it's like a VP of engineering and they do a lot of integrations between, let's call it HubSpot and ChatGPT, right? They know exactly the mistakes that end users are making when it comes to that integration. They know exactly how and why and when they should do that. They know the cost implications of that. They know the risks that are involved in that, and they can speak to it in a much deeper level. And sometimes that depth is exactly what we need to convey in a podcast guest pitch and certainly in the interview itself. So again, one of the solutions to all of this is what I'll call like the pre-planning phase or phase 0. And that's just increasing our level of research and due diligence on the front end. Solution number 2 to answer the question about how do we survive and thrive in this harder than ever podcast guest booking era is certainly going to be show selection. Now, show selection can truly make or break your campaign. You could write the best pitch to the perfect with the perfect tonality that's covering all the topics, et cetera. But if you're sending it to the wrong show, it's never going to get answered and you're never going to get that client booked as a guest on the podcast, right? So show selection becomes a huge component of our success. And when we were doing this on the Podchaser Connect side of the house, again, a few years ago at this point, we needed a way that we could build a process, a predictable process that was going to get us predictable outcomes in terms of finding best fit shows. And again, we were doing about 80 guest placements per month on behalf of our clients. So it had to be something that was repeatable. It had to be something that we could understand. Yes, like we can drop anybody into this situation. We can teach them this process and they can go filter through a sea of 5.6, 5.8 million podcasts and find the ones that matter most for our clients. And ultimately, what we came up with was what we call content, context, audience, and reach. I've done a lot of webinars on this topic. I've published a lot of content on this topic. So there are going to be slides over the next few series here. They're going to go really deep into that process. Again, for the purposes of our webinar here today, I want to keep the train moving a little bit along, but when we send over the recap and the recording, as well as the actual deck itself, you'll be able to view a lot more of that in detail. But how this is going to work is content, context, audience, and reach. Content, we want to find shows that are discussing topics that are relevant or germane to our guests' areas of interest or expertise. Context, we want to unpack what kind of perspective these shows have on said content. Now, the classic example that I always give is we were working with a pharmaceutical company that just came up with a new HPV vaccine. So we knew that they wanted to target moms because moms were typically making healthcare decisions as heads of household. And they wanted to make sure that the moms likely had kids aged 12 to 24, right? So again, we were able to use Podchaser Pro to find shows that were more popular with moms that had a median age that was kind of within that supporting range and that also had kids. So we were able to do that. We were able to find kind of mommy blogger, mommy podcaster types of shows that did just that. But when you kind of assess that market, right, there's going to be all different types of perspectives when it comes to mommy bloggers. So, in representing a pharmaceutical company that was doing an HPV vaccine, we certainly wanted to avoid shows that expressed vaccine hesitant or anti-vax positions because, again, our client's pharmaceutical company, and that's a no-go. So, again, contextually speaking, that might be one of the more important pieces of this process. And there's going to be different ways you can do it. A lot of it with Podchaser Pro, which is great. One of my favorites is looking at episode transcripts. We didn't have that capability back when we had our podcast guest booking agency, but we have it now. And I use that almost exclusively as means of qualifying in or qualifying out opportunities. For example, like with a transcript, we can see the types of questions that the host typically asks of their guests. We can see kind of the tone that they're asking these questions in. So again, we can infer some things. We can run it through sentiment analysis, that sort of thing, and just by means of context, incidentally. Podchaser now transcribes the top 24,000 podcasts globally, which means we've got about 5.3 million episode transcripts available for you all to take a look at. So again, if you haven't done this before, just go to a podcast page, navigate to the episodes tab, and then you can click on one of the episodes and then click view transcript. And with that, you can actually see the transcript with timestamps, etc. You can actually download that as a .txt file as well. So if you want to throw that into, a chat GPT or, another AI tool, which again is going to be a proper use of AI in this process, that's going to help, pull out some of the more interesting or pertinent pieces that you're going to need to assess whether or not a show is a fit for your client. And then also looking at previous guests. So going back to the content, context, audience, and reach, content, topics that are aligned, context, viewpoints that are aligned, audience, again, that's kind of self-explanatory, but reach. Reach we like to describe in our world as a spectrum when it comes to podcasts. So on one side of the spectrum, you're going to have these highly popular mass media, pop culture types of shows, typically hosted by a celebrity or a very well-known individual. These shows are oftentimes going to go about an inch deep in terms of content, but a mile wide in terms of content. So they're going to cover lots of different things, usually not going to be very technical, but they're going to have great reach. On the other side of the spectrum, you're going to have shows that are going to maybe only have 500, 600,000 listeners on a monthly basis. These shows are typically going to be hosted by subject matter experts. So when we think about positioning our clients as guests on podcasts, are we going to be able to tell a greater story or weave together a greater narrative when we've got a subject matter expert from our side who's having a peer-to-peer conversation with a fellow subject matter expert, and the audience, because it is niche or because it is technical or because it is very deep in terms of depth of content, are we going to be able to have a much better conversation where we can pull on some of these threads? And oftentimes that answer is yes. Now, again, reach I put last in this process, mostly because the vast majority of clients come to us say, how do we get on Joe Rogan? How do we get on the Daily? How do we get on NPR, et cetera? And I understand why that's the first question always asked, because oftentimes people will associate podcasts with the podcasts that they know. And usually those are going to be top 10, top 100, maybe top 1,000 podcasts. But in a sea of 5.6 million shows, there's going to be a lot of podcasts that you just don't even know exist. That doesn't mean we should ignore them. It means we should build out a strategic plan that covers all aspects or all areas of that spectrum, because there's a lot of different ways you can win, again, kind of going up and down the spectrum. But going back to the previous guests, again, if a show doesn't have the reach of a mass media show, that we don't want to neglect that. In fact, even with some of like these specialty business podcasts or tech podcasts, et cetera, might only have 6,000 monthly listens. But if the previous guests on that show, let's say I'm working with HubSpot, if the previous guests on that podcast are from Salesforce or Microsoft or OpenAI or any other software company, well, of course, if I'm HubSpot, I want to probably have one of my subject matter experts or thought leaders appear on that podcast as well, just by pure virtue of association, right? So it's going to lend some peer credibility as well. So again, the next few slides are going to be far more in the weeds in terms of content, context, audience, and reach, which I'm going to rip through now. And again, as you replay this or download the slides, you'll be able to reference this as well. But again, I give some real world examples, show you some of the ways that we parlay that into Podchaser Pro features and how to leverage those. And then that'll take us to solution number 3 for navigating through this more challenging guest booking environment, which is going to be to sharpen our pitches. Now, apologies in advance on this subheader here, but as it says, vanilla pitch equals Neapolitan results. I'm not a big ice cream guy, so I just did a quick Google search, and Google AI search actually told me that one of the least favorite flavors of ice cream is Neapolitan. So again, my apologies in advance if you are a Neapolitan stan, but this is what we get. So again, how do we move past generic pitches and level up, meet podcasters where they're at, advance the degree of professionalism which we're approaching podcasters? One of the ways to do this is going to be what we call the 4A's framework. Now, with the 4A's framework, again, I take no credit for creating this. This is actually popularized by a guy named Dickie Bush, who's actually a content creator in his own right. And how this is going to work is we're going to assess our guest as well as podcasts through these 4A's. And these 4A's are going to be aspirational, actionable, analytical, or anthropological. Again, there's going to be subsequent slides in which you can kind of review this or go look at some of our past webinars we've done about this. But the basic premise is that every piece of content, every individual, every podcast really falls into at least one, if not multiple, of these 4A's: actionable, analytical, aspirational, and anthropological. And if we can identify which of those A's our guest fits under, and we can find podcasts that match that A, well, then all of a sudden we can create a pitch that's aligning the A's between each other. And when we have that alignment, we're going to get a lot more yeses than nos. So what does this mean? Again, let's go back to our VP of engineering subject matter expert. Maybe they know the exact process and they've got a 12-step checklist or 12-step process for integrating HubSpot and ChatGPT. They know the mistakes people are often making. They know the lookouts or callouts that people should try to avoid. And they can kind of walk us through this 12-step process so people are avoiding the mistakes that most others make. Well, that sounds very actionable because I'm talking about a 12-step process. So I want to find podcasts that are discussing content or topics that are related. So this could be software integrations, this could be SaaS, this could be go to market, this could be, AI, whatever it might be. But I want to find podcasts that clearly call out that the types of content that they cover are also going to be process, actionable, and aligned with the actionability that our guest is providing. Oftentimes, you're going to find descriptors in podcast descriptions. So if you go to the about page of a podcast page on Podchaser, they're usually going to lay out what the show is about. Oftentimes, you can read between the lines about the premise of the show. So again, if it's analytical, actionable, anthropological, or aspirational. And once we do that, now we can craft a pitch where, instead of it being, hey, I'm representing Joe Schmo from XYZ Corporation. Think you'd be a really good fit for your podcast. You can cover A, B, and C topics. What do you think? We can now say, hey, we've got this 12-step process that we've seen play, and it's been able to drop implementation times of ChatGPT and HubSpot software by 67%, leading to A, B, and C outcomes, whatever the case might be. But again, it's going to be that alignment. We're going to talk about the process that they have, and it's going to be aligned with the show that is primarily focused on process. So again, a lot more details for you to observe on your own time. When it comes to forays, we'll rip through that here in a second, but the second thing to talk about when it comes to sharpening pitches is the follow-up. So currently working with the client, helping them do some of this. And the follow-up aspect is something that I think often is the source of a lot of consternation among media relations professionals or PR people, comms folk. There's a lot of varying opinions about should you follow up with journalists, should you follow up with media members, et cetera. And I can tell you in this one client that I'm currently working with, of the 6 opportunities that they've secured, 3 of them have come on follow-ups. And I'm talking the second or third follow-up specifically. Now, there's an art to following up. We don't want to just, leave them on the hook saying, hey, what'd you think about this? And not really provide any sort of value. And this is where our third bullet point here, value for value, comes into play. If you have the ability, or your client's given you the green light to share how they plan to promote the podcast episode itself, that's a really good way to follow up. So this client is a nationally known brand. You've heard of them. They've been around for a long time. And the value for value in the follow-up is actually, and hey, you know what? We'd actually be really happy to promote the podcast episode from the brand's corporate social accounts. And 2 of the 6 responses that came off of the follow-ups were in direct appreciation of, oh yeah, that'd be great if they could share the episode from the corporate account. Because one, obviously it shows that you're invested, or your client's invested in actually making this podcast go well. 2, it's going to give the podcaster a lot more visibility, especially when it's coming from a verified corporate account that has hundreds of thousands of followers, which is going to expose them to a greater audience. And these are the types of things where that's not going to be true of all of your clients, of course. But again, we don't want to just follow up for the sake of following up. We know podcasters are busy. Yes, some of them are eschewed 9 to 5 and instead made this a full-time thing, but they're getting heaps and heaps and heaps of inbound pitches. So sometimes we just do need to follow up. So again, there's an art and a science to it for sure. So this is going to be the aforementioned forays framework. Again, just going through this real quick. Actionable, analytical, aspirational, and anthropological. And actionable is going to be here's how, analytical, here are the numbers, aspirational, yes, you can, and anthropological, here's why. Again, I'm just going to rip through this pretty quickly, but I do present an example. This is going to be a series of books that are all about money, but they approach money from very different lenses. And again, we give you a lot of reasons and kind of the logic behind this as well. So as we continue right along, please do review that in depth. We also, again, want to really emphasize the point that step 1 is understanding your client's A, and then step 2 is finding podcasts that match that A. And of course, tying that all together into what we'll call an irresistible pitch. But that's going to take us to solution four, which is really going to be about strengthening thought leadership strategies writ large. And I'm going to call this like attracting inbound interest. Now, I know a lot of agencies, when they're working with clients, podcasts might be the cherry on top of a scope of work or retainer agreement or whatever your setup might be. And oftentimes it's also going to be inclusive of creating content for social media or for blogs or what have you. Now, I think one thing that is really important in this is you can create a self-sustaining kind of cyclical virtuous cycle, if you will, when you're also helping a client produce content for social media, for blog content, et cetera, wherein you get them to publish content, you get them to publish content consistently. All of a sudden, they're starting to appear in other people's feeds. Other people's feeds might also include podcasters, whatever the case might be. But in some of these examples here, right? So this is John Bonini. He was the former director of marketing at DataBox. And in this, just the highlighted portion here, one of my clients has been invited on 6 podcasts in the last 3 months, all because she's been consistently sharing her perspective on LinkedIn and in her new newsletter. So again, with this, we want to increase the surface area of luck when it comes to landing podcast guest appearances. And of course, when there is name recognition or name awareness, if you will. Oh, I think I've seen a post from that person on social media or LinkedIn or whatever it might be. It's going to at least get them to open it, right? Now, again, there's a lot more work to do in terms of tying the pitch together, but this kind of theme or idea or notion of increasing the surface area of luck, I think, is a good one. Now, when it comes to expanding thought leadership strategies outside of just podcast guest booking, I think there's a couple really important call outs. One is choosing the right channels. So LinkedIn, and I've been a LinkedIn content creator for over 10 years now at this point, I believe. LinkedIn is great, especially when you are working in B2B, but certainly even outside of that. We're seeing like tech folks and science folks, all kinds of content being produced on LinkedIn. It's certainly moved past just the destination for job seekers. So, LinkedIn's going to be a really strong one. X could be a strong one. Instagram, if it's more CPG or direct to consumer or more consumer facing, whatever the case might be. But the emphasis here again is to choose the right channels for your client. It should be ones that they're comfortable with, where the target audience actually hangs out, et cetera. Secondarily, the commitment to consistency is a huge driver of success with this. As you can see here, this is Peter Caputa. He says, I get more podcast appearance requests than I can handle now. They all come as a result of me publishing posts on my newsletters on LinkedIn. I post every day and send my newsletter every 2 weeks. The consistency and frequency is the key. So again, going back to this idea of increasing the surface area of luck, the more you appear, the more you get your name out there, oftentimes the greater the chance of being able to land a guest appearance. And then this is probably another conversation for another day, but one of the kind of keys to the thought leadership is not just being a broadcast channel or post and ghost. So it's great when you rip off a banger LinkedIn post and you get a ton of engagement, but that's only half the battle. Secondarily, you should also be proactively engaging with other accounts, especially if they're podcasters. So if you're running your client's own, if you're running your client's social media profiles, like on LinkedIn or X, for example, go ahead and send a connection request or a follow to these podcasters that you've identified as being good fits. If nothing else, it's going to create, at least one less degree of separation between them. Two, that name recognition is going to show up. And three, they're going to start to see the content of your client in their feed more often, right? And if you don't have managed access to their accounts, I highly recommend imparting on your client to go out and do these things on their own accord as well, because again, that's what they're paying you for. Like, you need to be in the driver's seat. You need to be order making, not order taking when it comes to this kind of stuff. So again, podcast guesting can really accelerate this virtuous cycle, especially when they get on one podcast and then that podcast is heard by other people in the industry. And then when you go out pitch another podcast, oh yeah, I heard you on Pete Caputo's podcast, and so on down the line it goes. So again, virtuous cycles, thanks to that. And then the fifth solution is going to be asking for referrals. This is something I don't think happens nearly often enough, and there's zero downside, truthfully, when done correctly, but there is almost unlimited upside. So if you have got a great recording and the podcaster comes back and said, I had an awesome conversation with so and so, it's going to go live XYZ date. Say, it's so great to hear. We really prepped them a lot for this. By the way, if you have any other podcaster friends that would be a good fit, would you be open to making any recommendations or suggestions or introductions for that matter? And I've actually seen this play out in real time. So what you'll see here is a series of notes, but Ken, who's the podcast host, said we had a wonderful talk. It's actually one of the longest interviews I've ever done. There's so much to cover. I said, great, awesome to hear. If you have any podcaster friends in this category, that'd be a good fit. I'm sure she'd appreciate it. And sure enough, he says, well, how about this podcast? Now, the podcast that he recommended is actually one that we had pitched previously with no response. But now with the Ken seal of approval, or Ken letter of a recommendation, if you will, I was able to use that with permission to go back to that podcast and say, hey, actually, by the way, we were just on Ken's podcast, and he thought might be some alignment between the two of them. So, would you be open to having my client as a guest on the show? Sure enough, it worked. So again, we want to save this for when things go well. Obviously, we want to avoid it if we've done anything or our clients have done anything to make the experience less than positive. But again, podcasters are going to be a tight-knit community, and they talk, and most of them know each other, especially in certain categories. So again, very limited downside, but a lot of upside here. So again, we talked about a lot of the challenges. We had some of that sobering conversation. Hopefully you've identified some solutions for moving forward and navigating through in it. It's going to, again, be a very intentional process. It's going to take some time to understand and implement content, context, audience, and reach, the 4A's framework, et cetera. But this is another huge trend that we're seeing, and that's that shift to video podcasts. Already talked about it a little bit, but there are some kind of interesting points here I think we need to address. So why is video taking off? Well, first and foremost, YouTube started ingesting RSS feeds about a year ago. Now, why do podcasters care about that? Well, one, podcasts are notoriously difficult to grow and to discover because there's not a lot of centralization in terms of finding shows. Yes, you're going to have Apple. Yes, you're going to have Spotify. Yes, you're going to have Podchaser and various others. But the way in which YouTube works is it's so algorithmically driven, right? And perhaps you've even experienced this yourself. You look up a recipe tutorial or how to change a light bulb, and all of a sudden you get recommended these next 6 videos, and it's based on tons and tons of data. So they're serving up to you recommended content that is oftentimes very aligned with what you're actually seeking, right? So for a podcast, you can understand, again, they're going to be able to really amplify their reach as a result of it. And we've seen a lot of success stories from podcasters already. Obviously, there's just a different level of quality that exists with podcasts that also have a YouTube component. So again, that simulcast nature. We'll get into some of the finer details about that in the next slide. But kind of comparatively, the vidification, if you will, of all other social platforms has also created this rise of the video podcast. So content channels like TikTok, Instagram Reels, X, LinkedIn, Facebook, all of these channels podcasters are going to use for distribution of their content. Again, because that's where a lot of folks are going to discover their content for the very first time, whether that's through somebody else sharing it being fed to them algorithmically, et cetera. So I remember sitting about 15 years ago at a Facebook agency partners event in Chicago. And 15 years ago, Facebook was saying, video is here. Video is going to take over the world. And at the time, we didn't have the tech really. So like our iPhones were still kind of nascent in terms of their video capabilities. We certainly didn't have editing apps. We didn't have easy to use tools that made video much much more accessible, if you will. But now we do. And as a result of that, it's so much easier to create video. And video, as we know, is a multi-sensory medium versus podcast being a single sensory medium. So audio, you're only hearing versus video, you're seeing and you're hearing. And there's a lot of research that's been done that indicates, multi-sensory experiences have a far greater impact on brand awareness, brand recognition, brand recall, as well as a variety of other things as well, right? So again, if distribution is a challenge and we're solving distribution through social, and the best way to do that now on social is through video, we're going to see podcasters double down on that media type. Next, why is video happening? Well, advertiser demand. And again, going back to how a lot of podcasters have gone from eschewing their 9 to 5 work days and going, full creator mode, if you will. They are somewhat beholden to advertisers, and advertisers also understand this multisensory environment. They know like a host read endorsement on a podcast of, let's call it like a protein supplement, is going to work usually pretty well, especially when there's a story associated with it, et cetera. It kind of gives that influencer feel. But when you can then marry that with also having the bottle of protein on the podcaster's desk as they're recording their video, I'm hearing it, but I'm now also seeing it, right? So I'm engaging both of my senses, and that is great for product placement. It's great for content repurposing. So oftentimes you'll see podcast clips where, a product is displayed prominently behind a podcaster. You'll see that run as paid social, across Instagram, for example. And so now we've got that host read endorsement plus video, and we're able to get better, CPA or CPC as a result of it, right? So advertisers are largely driving that forward as well. And why are they doing that? Mostly because video, whether it's on YouTube, certainly on YouTube, but also Instagram, X, TikTok, et cetera, it's way easier to measure consumption metrics on those platforms than it is on podcasts. Podcast consumption metrics are typically going to come from platform level or hosting provider level. So like Apple or Spotify or even, whatever the podcast hosting provider is going to be. And that's not even something that Podchaser has when it comes to data, because it is so insanely valuable and it lives behind the walled garden. Of course, these are going to be like very unique data points that they don't want to share, not with us, not really with anybody. So those consumption metrics are huge, and that continues to kind of drive video forward. And then finally, the professional podcaster class, a lot of them have grown up, if you will, and have really treated this as their career and their profession now. And a lot of that, I think, is rooted in the fracturing of media. And so if you look at some of the recent data and polls, as well as research studies, like trust in traditional media is at an all-time low, or certainly approaching that mark. I'm not going to get into the reasons why or any of that, but in a lot of cases, this citizen journalism or creator economy, what's interesting is they've largely started to displace legacy media. However, they're also adopting a lot of what legacy media did to get to institutional level to begin with, right? So that's going to look at studio build outs. That's going to look at on-site related things. That's going to be upgrading equipment and tech and all of the fun stuff behind the scenes there. And I don't know if you watch podcasts, but you can see a lot of these podcasts, have a fully built studio. There's some controversy about this as it pertains to the 2024 podcast election too, which again, look that up on your own. I'm not going to go too deep into it today. But all this infrastructure now exists, and that represents a really great opportunity. It also creates a very interesting challenge when it comes to us as earned media professionals, which we'll get into on the next slide here. But with this move to in-person or video recording, like the quality has to be a certain way. And when we think about, again, that last peak that podcasts had, and call it the pandemic era, right? Everything was remote. People were doing Zoom calls just to talk to their families and having work calls on Zoom and Google Meets or Teams or whatever it might be. But as we've moved, 5 years kind of past that era, we're doing a little bit less of that. We're doing a lot more in-person stuff again. And that's also true of podcasts. So again, this is going to introduce some interesting logistical challenges for us. But again, there's going to be some ways we can navigate through. So finally, what are we going to do about this rise of video podcasts? Again, it represents a great opportunity, but we need to be prepared. And one of the best things that we can do is get our clients prepared with at least passable audio video capabilities. I'm using a Shure MV7. You can get it on Amazon. It's like 250, 260 bucks. If you're going to be doing podcast guest booking and the client has the desire, I highly recommend getting them to invest in a decent mic. Certainly, the days of just recording off your MacBook are gone. Especially if a host is worth their weight, right? They're going to have a better mic, and the listener's experience, kind of context switching from a crystal clear sound from the host to an awful crackle muffled sound from just like a laptop speaker, is going to be very difficult for the audience to comprehend, one, and likely they're going to jump out of the episode and find a different one to listen to. So again, all that work that you did, all the research, properly pitching, etc., it's all going to be for waste if nobody actually listens to it because your client doesn't sound good. And when it comes to video, especially, I've talked about this in a couple of webinars before, and I also have a guide that we put together on how to kind of level this up. But what I'm looking at you through is called, it's actually my old iPhone 10, and I'm running an app called Camo. They have a free version, they've got a paid version, but how it works is I hook my USB-C up into it. It then comes through a dongle. In the dongle, both the camera on the iPhone 10 as well as the Shure MV7 are connected. It's really simple to get it set up, but again, it's going to make a world of a difference in terms of how you're presented. Now, of course, you can go above and beyond, right? You can have a full-on mixer for audio. You can have a full-on, DSLR 4K camera. It's going to be a lot higher quality than what you're seeing right now. But at the very least, I would say my setup is passable. But if I were going to go on a 75 plus power score show, I would probably, and it was going to be remote, I would probably try to get my butt into a studio and have a higher level of fidelity for both audio and video. And with this, again, talking points we want to structure for clips, not just these what I'll call circuitous conversations. So your client might have like one of the more interesting stories out there, which is great. But if they take the meandering path to kind of land the plane, if you will, it's going to be a lot more difficult for the host or the editor to actually clip that for a 15, 30, 60-second clip that's going to be distributed on YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels or TikTok. You just don't have the benefit of the long and winding road with a lot of these short form channels. So in media training and getting clients prepared for it, like how do we pack the biggest punch? How do we land the thing it is that we want to convey in as tight a window as possible, so it's a lot easier to clip and then get distributed and then amplified, and then again another virtuous cycle that's created, right? So someone sees it, wow, I never heard that before. Oh, is this true? I'm gonna go check out the full episode. Again, we want to leave these breadcrumb trails that lead people back to the full episode because again, is our job as earned media professionals is we want people to get the full story, right? So this is difficult. It's going to take some training and some practice, but it's a huge part. And then finally, and this is one that I want to kind of raise the alarm bell for, and that's going to be the in-person or in-studio opportunities. So I've referenced this client a couple of times. Again, six appearances secured, or at least six appearances that have said yes. Of those six, 5 of them require that the episode is recorded in person. Now, the guest is based in Bloomington, Indiana. The geographical spread of these required in-studio appearances include Los Angeles, 2 in New York, 2 in Austin, no, 1 in Austin and 1 in Miami. Now, great, we secured interest, client happy, but now I have to figure out, do we want to get them on a plane to fly to LA, fly to New York, fly to Austin, fly to Miami? All of a sudden it becomes a lot, right? So Podchaser doesn't yet have a filter for this. It's something we're talking about a lot. We're deep in the rumination stage about how to solve for this. But there are some ways in which we can actually triangulate some of this before we get too deep into the process, before we have to turn down an opportunity because we can't fulfill the requirement of it being in person. The easiest way to do this is going to be to check the podcast socials for cues. So especially if they've got a YouTube channel, like you can just look at their last, 5, 6 videos. If it appears that all of their guests are sitting across from them in the studio, that might be an indicator for us that it's not going to happen. That said, going back to the value for value thing, one of these appearances the client has secured is again insistent on it being in person. That said, they did open up the opportunity where if the client was open or willing to collaborate on putting some paid promotion behind the remote recording, they would make an exception to their requirement. Now, again, does that equal earned media? Is it paid media? I don't know. That's kind of up to you and to your client on how to assess that situation. But it is something that given all of the context that we've kind of laid out here, is something that should be part of your consideration set. Now, these in studio or in person ops are going to be more common with network affiliated shows. And oftentimes these geographical spreads are going to be in major metros. So you think about LA, of course, LA is going to have a ton of studio capabilities because Hollywood's in their backyard. New York, media capital of the world. A lot of legacy institutions run out of there. So of course, there's going to be a lot more like studio setups. And then also looking at Austin, so call it the Joe Rogan effect, but obviously he moved his studio from LA down to Austin, and as a result, the local podcasting scene is booming, which is a good thing. So again, other regional hubs like Miami, Denver, Chicago, Atlanta, of course, very famous CNN hub, etc. It's not uncommon to find this. So again, how are we going to understand, the requirements until Podchaser has a filter for it? We want to check out the social cues that we're going to get from the podcast social handles. And then finally, we want to weigh production value versus logistics costs. So again, there's going to be trade-offs here. If you can be in studio with a really high value opportunity and it's going to be worth it because you're going to be able to use that video for blog content, social content, newsletter content, etc. Sometimes it might actually be worth it to pay for a plane ticket. But again, the logistics are going to be the logistics. So I expect this trend to continue. And again, we're working hard behind the scenes to figure out a solution that's scalable for you as users. So in any case, again, throughout the course of this, over the last 6 months, we've seen some seismic shifts within the podcast guest booking landscape. There are obviously a ton of challenges, but hopefully we've identified some solutions for you to move forward through that confidently. Really, if you take anything away from this, slow is fast and fast is slow. Let's be intentional about podcast guest booking. Let's try some of these frameworks like content, context, audience, and reach, Floray's framework. Let's get our clients prepared for this new world. And again, there's going to be ample opportunity within the podcast landscape through the rest of 2025 and certainly beyond. So thank you for attending today's session. If you have any questions or comments, you can shoot me an email, trent@podchaser.com, or contact your client success manager, whether it's Jules, John, or Sydney. Appreciate your attention today. And again, this webinar will be up on our YouTube channel, as well as distributed via email, along with the associated slides early next week. So thanks again. Have a great weekend.